Okay, well, let's get started. Good morning, everyone. We are scattered over the world in Europe and in the United States, and I just wanted to provide a little bit of an introduction. My name is Philip Tabus. I'm a special advisor with the Nature Conservancy in Arlington, Virginia. Welcome to the first of 4 webinars under the auspices of the European Union's Life Plus program, which has provided generous support for this Land is Forever project. The overall goals of the Land is Forever project is to understand the preferences by private landowners for new voluntary conservation tools and to investigate existing tools and structures that could expand their use. We also would like to be able to try to identify new and innovative policies that might be appropriate to encourage more landowners to undertake conservation projects on their property. The Land is Forever project is being carried out jointly by the European Landowners Organization, the largest organization representing the interest of European landowners, and through the Nature Conservancy, the largest private land conservation dedicated to protecting the lands and waters on which all life depends. Originally, we had planned to have an in-person study tour to share the work that we were doing in the US with our European colleagues. But unfortunately, events intervened and we now are unable to have an in-person study tour. And so unfortunately, we will have to postpone that study tour, and we're hoping to be able to conduct a study tour in the spring of 2021. Assuming that travel is permitted then, we will be arranging the logistics for that tour in the future, and we will communicate that to our network at that time. For the next 2 weeks, there will be 4 webinars. Today, we're going to be visiting some conservation sites and projects in the eastern mid-Atlantic region in the state of Maryland. And on Wednesday, we will be visiting the state of Virginia to hear about some of the projects that they are undertaking in that state as well. On Monday, September 28th, webinar 3 will focus on innovative case studies of private land conservation in Europe. And on Wednesday, September 30th, session 4 will focus on, is there a future for private land conservation tools in Europe? And more information can be found on the ELO website and on the website for Land is Forever. Just a word about the 4 projects, or the projects that you're going to hear about today and on Wednesday. Some of the broad approaches or themes in private land conservation in the US that has made it so successful are illustrated by these projects. And those themes include collaboration between conservation organizations and private landowners, the use of conservation easements and other kinds of cooperative management agreements, ownership of land by NGOs in the form of nature preserves and protected areas, the important role that conservation science plays in private land management, and finally, the importance of financial and tax incentives in motivating private lands conservation. So without further ado, let me turn it over to my colleague, Deborah Barber, who is the Director of Land Management for the Nature Conservancy in the state of Maryland. Deborah, over to you.
Thank you, Phil. Good afternoon. I am so very pleased to welcome you to the Mid-Atlantic area virtually and to introduce my colleagues. So if we can see the next slide. And while we are giving our presentations about 4 areas in Maryland, please feel free to type in questions into the question and answer box, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. So here we have the Mid-Atlantic area. In the middle of your screen, you see the states of Maryland and Virginia. Maryland will be visiting today, and Virginia will be visiting virtually on Wednesday. And if you show the next slide, you will see a closer look at the state of Maryland with the green oak leaves symbolizing the preserves owned by the Nature Conservancy around the state. Although we have a proud history of land conservation, you will see that compared to the overall land mass of the state, the preserves are extraordinarily small. So it's essential to engage with partners for long-term conservation. And the next slide will show you another view of the state of Maryland. And you can see right in the center, Washington, D.C. Then to the east, you've got the coastal plain, which we call the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay, or we also call it the Delmarva Peninsula. And we'll be looking at 3 sites on the Delmarva Peninsula today. And then in western Maryland, near the city of Hagerstown, And we'll be looking at a fourth site, which is in the ancient and beautiful Central Appalachian Mountains. So the first speaker we have today is Gabe Cahalan, who will be speaking about a restoration project that we have at Jackson Lane. After that, we'll be hearing from Deborah Landau speaking about a sustainable forest and restoration project, and then Mike Dryden, another project in the coastal plain, and then back again to Deborah Landau to speak about a project that we have in the Appalachian Mountains. So first we'll hear from Gabe Cahalan, who will be talking about a project that we have done for many years at our beautiful Jackson Lane Preserve in the coastal plain. Gabe?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Today, I'll start with talking a little bit about the site and the history of the site. I'll be talking about a wetland restoration at a site that the Nature Conservancy owns in fee called the Jackson Lane Preserve. This preserve is located, as Deborah showed in her previous map, on the Delmarva Peninsula, close to the border with the state of Delaware. Next slide. This site, through time, has changed. It started out as a complex of forested wetlands. These are called, we call them Delmarva bays. They're very similar to another habitat type that occurs further south called Carolina bays. These are seasonally flooded depressional wetlands known as coastal plain ponds, once found in abundance. They're thought to have originated as wind-blown features at the end of the last ice age. And the hydrology and chemistry of Delmarva bays is intricately and dynamically linked to local groundwater systems. These open canopy Delmarva bays also provide habitat for dozens of rare, threatened, and endangered species, as well as several regionally rare frog species. So sometime in the 1970s, early 70s, next slide, please, a local farmer cleared a portion of this area and put in ditches to drain the wetlands in order to farm the area. In 1999, the Nature Conservancy purchased 133 hectares of those farm fields. Next slide. They looked like this at the time. The total preserve area then, after purchasing the farm fields adjacent to the natural area, was 255 hectares. Next slide, please. In 2003, the Nature Conservancy began to restore the northern portion of the farm fields by placing ditch plugs, 23 earthen ditch plugs or berms. We used substrate excavated immediately adjacent to the berms, and they ranged in depth from less than 1 foot to about 4 feet in size. These techniques included creating pit and mound microtopography by using a backhoe to scoop out 1 bucket of soil, placing coarse woody debris, as you can see in this picture, surplus tree trunks and stumps from a log site in Delaware, in and around the edges of the wetland cells to provide shelter and diverse microhabitats for wildlife. We also place straw on the pond substrates to suppress weeds and provide organic matter for aquatic communities. Next slide. The partners included the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Maryland Department of the Environment, and the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service, and used funding from the USDA Wetland Reserve Program Cost Share Grant. Next slide. This is a planning map showing the ditch plug locations and the different wetland cells, as well as vegetation transects that were monitored after the restoration. Next slide. "700 shrubs and trees, as well as 80,000 tree seedlings were also planted at this site." Next slide. Larger trees in some areas were girdled to create the open canopy habitat conditions required by some of the species. Next slide. And then finally, after the restoration, we used funding from the farm lease on adjacent farm fields that were not restored, as well as from a private foundation to fund research and monitoring. Next slide. This site provided an ideal location to study wetland restoration because of the adjacent natural wetlands that could be used as a control. Next slide. This is what the site looked like not long after the restoration. You can see the farm fields at the bottom that were not restored versus the farm fields to the north that were restored, which are holding more water. Next slide. This is another view, the same location, not long after the restoration. Next slide. So some results. We had early highlights where we had 55 species of dragonflies and damselflies on the site, 28 species of amphibians and reptiles, 72 bird species. Next slide. 72 bird species at the restoration site versus 53 in the wooded preserve adjacent. We also had diverse macro invertebrate and algae communities in the restored wetlands with differences between the different cells and ponds. Some wetlands have fish, eastern mud minnow and chain pickerel, and some do not. But you can see from this slide that the natural area is still different in terms of vegetation from this ordination. Next slide. This is showing some of the wetland plants. We had a really good response just a year or two after the restoration. Next slide. Christina, could you show the video? So this is almost 20 years later or 15 years later, showing the same site that you can see much of the trees have grown up. We continue to monitor the site, and so far the surrounding community has been supportive, and we've started to work with local NGOs on restoration in the farm fields. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabe. Remember that you can type questions for any speaker in the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll take those in about 10 or 15 minutes following all of the presentations. Next, we'll be hearing from Deborah Landau about Nassawango Creek, which is the beautiful site that you see behind me in my virtual background. And she'll be talking about sustainable forest management efforts and another large wetland restoration project that we've done there on this large site, which is our largest Nature Conservancy preserve in the state of Maryland. Deborah?
Thank you, Deborah. So yes, I'm going to be talking about two different kind of programs. One is a voluntary conservation measure that's actually internationally available, the Forest Stewardship Council certification, and I'll also be talking about some state, federal, and private programs that we took advantage of and enrolled in order to protect some land. So here's a map of our Nassawango Creek Preserve. It's about 10,000 acres. So our largest private land preservation area in the state of Maryland. The preserve is in green and it follows along Nassawango Creek. In orange, surrounding the preserve, we have state land, and in the hatched marks, we have easements. So it's a really nice continuity of protected land, both private and state. So I'll go to the next slide. So Nassawango Creek Preserve is a really diverse assemblage of habitats. It has bottomland forest, it has cypress swamp, it also has these high, sandy, grassy habitats that are remnants of ancient sand dunes. So a really interesting diversity of habitats. But more than half of the preserve, when we acquired it, consisted of loblolly pine plantations. And as you can see underneath, they're essentially, they're an ecological desert. There's no diversity underneath. And one of the things that we've struggled with is how to restore these pine plantations to these more natural habitats. So next slide. So when we acquired the preserve, again, about 6,000 acres of it is an upland forest. And on the left, in pink, one of the tracts that we had acquired came with the forest management plan. And we found that this really gave us excellent guidance into figuring out how to restore these pine plantations. So on the right, we decided to enroll an additional 5 or 6 tracts into these management plans. And the state has many excellent programs that assist private landowners in enrolling in these, in putting together these management plans. And it really gives excellent guidance into how you can address your pine or forest plantations and how you can responsibly harvest them. So the next slide. So we voluntarily enrolled in the Forest Stewardship Council's certification program. For the Nature Conservancy, it's actually a requirement if we're going to do any harvests to enroll in third-party certification. But anybody can do this. And the mission of FSC is essentially to promote environmentally sound, socially beneficial, and economically prosperous management of all the world's forests. So helping you manage your forests in an ecologically sustainable way. We had the advantage that the state of Maryland had already enrolled in FSC certification. So on one hand, they were familiar with the process so that when we invited them to sit in on our audits, they knew what we were talking about. But also, since they had certified first, they had invited us to their audits. So we understood how the process worked. And that was extremely beneficial to both of us. So the next slide, just very, very quickly, Forest Stewardship Council certification consists of 10 principles, essentially complying with laws, workers' rights and safe conditions, indigenous peoples' rights. We make sure that all the areas we're harvesting that they're not significant to indigenous peoples. We have to take into consideration community relations, benefits from the forest, environmental values and impact. Obviously, we have to start with a management plan, which I showed you, and then monitoring and assessing how the harvests are going and the impacts they're having on the natural areas. And then have focus on high conservation value areas and making sure that you're properly implementing these management activities. So in the next slide, we had many benefits from this process. It ensured that we use only the best practices and innovative techniques such as controlled burning and hydrological restoration. And we're constantly learning from our experiences. It also adds credibility to our harvests. As a land conservation institution, to be harvesting trees can look bad. So this really shows that there's oversight in our practices. And it really allowed us to network with our state and federal and private partners to talk about what we're doing, inviting them to the audit so they can see the thought process that we went through while deciding where and how to harvest at our preserves. So next slide. So back to the map of Naswanga Creek. At the north end, you'll see in yellow is the Taylor Tract, and this is our newest land acquisition. And it's essentially at the headwaters of Naswanga Creek. So the next slide. So Taylor Farm is just under 700 acres, about 280 hectares. And it had some 150 some hectares of marginal cropland. It was in corn and soybean rotation, as well as about 120 some hectares of woodlands. So the Nature Conservancy identified this farmland as an area that we wanted to protect. So what we did here was pretty innovative in which we identified programs in which the private landowner who was farming the property could enroll. So at the next slide, I'll show you. So we had them, after many discussions, had them enroll through the National Resources Conservation Service in WRP, or a wetland restoration program. And essentially what that does is it allowed us to, while they were owning it, to bring in the NRCS and put together a very comprehensive restoration plan, allowing for some 154 hectares of their cropland to be restored into forested wetland. It also allowed for 312 acres, or 126 hectares of forested uplands and wetlands to be protected. So altogether, at the end of this, the Natural Resources Conservation Service was able to acquire an easement on the entire 693 acres, or 280 hectares. And again, this was in partnership with the NRCS, the state of Maryland, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, as well as the original owners. So once this easement was put in place and the restoration had started, the Nature Conservancy then acquired the land, and we were able to purchase the land for 1/3 of the fair market value. So now it was protected, but the value had been lowered. So next slide, and I'll just show you a couple of quick pictures. So this program allowed us to put together this really comprehensive plan that the USDA, the US Department of Agriculture, put together for us. Next slide. And with the funding from this program, we were able to pay for, first we plugged many of the ditches, and some of the ditches we actually widened them so that they're acting more like historic floodplains, so that the water is dispersed and we're restoring this area. Almost the opposite of what Gabe had described, in which the farmer purchased a wetland and ditched and drained it. Now we were doing the opposite. So the next slide, we were also able to, here's just a picture of what looks like beforehand, with these straight, very deep ditches, very quickly pulling water off of this historic wetland, and we're widening those back up. The next slide, we also were able to plant 90,000 native plants and shrubs. Next slide. And so here is what it looks like when we were first visiting the site. It's in corn. And then the next slide shows what it looked like after all the work was put in to plug and widen those ditches. 2017 was a very wet year, so it's particularly wet, but it looks, in my opinion, a lot better than a cornfield. And then the next slide shows, we were really able to highlight the conservation success here, and we brought in partners from the Fish and Wildlife Service, from the Department of Natural Resources, from the NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Districts, as well as and the farmer, the private landowner, who was integral in this process, and could really highlight this wonderful partnership in which really we felt that we all benefited, as well as most certainly the land. Next slide. And this picture was taken just last week, and this is how it looks right now. So it's a spectacular restoration project. Now the Nature Conservancy owned it. It's part of our preserve, and it's filtering and providing wonderful benefit to the headwaters of the Naswanga Creek and throughout the Eastern Shore. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. So far, you've heard about 2 restoration projects that have taken place on land owned by the Nature Conservancy and maintained as a nature preserve. Now you'll be hearing from Mike Dryden about a property that has taken place on partner land. Mike?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to some of us. I'm going to talk about a restoration project that we completed back in 2018 on private land. You can look at the aerial that's being shown right now. That's the entire project area, and I'll go into more details on what we've done out there. But everything in the blue is the actual wetlands that have been restored. And we can go to the next slide. So just the background of where this project is. This is on the eastern shore of Maryland, which we saw a map earlier with the presentation. The star, if you look closely, is actually where the project is in this watershed. And the red outline is the entire Pocomoke River watershed that we've been working in for the past 7 years. Just a couple little side notes. The Pocomoke River drains waters from 3 states and 4 counties. Its channelized system is 73 miles long. It was originally channelized in the 40s for agriculture, and it's the easternmost river that flows into the Chesapeake Bay. Next slide. So just a little bit about this project. It was a 300-acre restoration project. We created 11 breaches, which I'll show you an image of that in a little bit. We had 54 ditch plugs and 1 shallow wetland area. Again, it was completed in 2018. It was a big partnership with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, USDA, Natural Resource Conservation, and Maryland's DNR. All of us involved helped create this just a great project, and it's just not one person involved. This was private land. It's called the Harkins Restoration Project because the landowner was, or is, Mr. George Harkins. He's a landowner in this area and owns quite a few other parcels that also have this program. So this is a USDA program that we put onto this property. We brought the option to Mr. Harkins. You can see the land rates, $1,800 per acre for woodland, $5,800 for ag land. That's a permanent easement on the property once the landowner enrolls. That it's a 2-year process before the landowner would ever see the financial incentive. And during this process, we complete boundary surveys to delineate the easement areas, the areas that are going to be impacted for the wetland restoration, as well as we contract out to local contractors to help stimulate our local economy that are professionals in this field, so they can go out and construct these large projects for us. And you can see in the picture there, it kind of gives you an idea of one of the breaches that I'm talking about. And the breaches are, when we channelized the system back in the 40s, we cut off the floodplains that were originally there and how the system just meandered as a normal stream. So by channelizing it, they placed the spoil piles on each side of the river system, blocking the floodplain, so just cutting it completely off. So our goal is for these programs, or in this project specifically, is to go in there and remove that spoil. And as you can see, the excavator is actually sitting on top of the spoil pile, and beyond the bucket there is the floodplain. So is what we're doing when we construct these breaches. We are bringing that floodplain elevation to the top of bank of the river. So during these storm events, we're reintroducing the floodwaters back into that degraded, cut-off floodplain. Next picture, or slide, I'm sorry. So the story behind this project, it's a private landowner, and when we're performing outreach to try to move a lot of these programs to educate the landowners in the area, it's a very difficult process because a lot of landowners, for one, aren't aware of these programs. Two, it can be a big feat to come into an easement to privately protect your property for perpetuity. So it can be scary, I think, for a lot of landowners. But once they're educated and understand what we're doing, it's a great thing. And Mr. Harkins, the story behind this project, I met Mr. Harkins probably 15 years ago on a project that I was doing with a previous employer. And, right off the bat, he's a conservationist. He's an outdoorsman. He loves hunting. He loves everything about, the landscape that we have here on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. And when I met with him about, talking about putting the property into an easement and allowing us to do these wetland restoration projects on his property, he was totally for it. When we started the project, he was hands-on with us. He was willing to learn what we were doing, and he's been completely excited about the whole thing. I still stay in contact with him, and he's always letting us know what he's seeing out there, the wild turkeys, the ducks, the deer, everything. So it's just wonderful to have the opportunity to work with a landowner that is so supportive of what we're doing, and they see the big picture. Next slide, please. This is an aerial photo of one of the breaches that I've been mentioning. The little white dots there are TNC staff and some external colleagues, and we're just doing an inspection of the breach to see what it looks like. The arrows that I have on there, you can see the river system. So during those storm events, that's when the river when we see the higher rising water flows. They have that opportunity now to re-enter into that now open floodplain. There's no more barrier for the water to flow in. And these breaches, they act as inlet. So during the storm event, they actually recede. So we're not increasing the water flow in these properties, just how often it's going in is what we're controlling now. And that's a big conversation piece we have with landowners, because that's also part of, are you guys going to flood us out? What's going to happen if I do this? And so we do a lot of science behind this to make sure we're not flooding out adjacent landowners. And where we're focused at is where the project's going to benefit and reintroduce the hydrology. Next slide, please. And so this is the finished product. This is right after a storm event, and you can see how the breaches are reintroducing that water back into those floodplains. So it's a successful project. And these breaches, they vary in length from 200 feet to 100 feet, and the width varies also depending on the spoil pile. So they could be either 60 feet deep by 30 feet deep. We have over 130 of these breaches now on this system, with almost 4,000 acres permanently protected and restored. And we are continuing to move forward with more projects. We are actually in the permitting process to start another section of this system, hopefully next month. So with that, thank you.
Thank you, Mike. All right, next we're going to be traveling west across the Chesapeake Bay to the Appalachian Mountains, and we'll be hearing from Deborah Landau again about some work at our Sidling Hill Creek Preserve, both work on our preserve and work on some land that she owns. She acquired a lovely country cabin adjacent to our Sidling Hill Creek Preserve, so she can speak to you both as our staff conservation ecologist and as another private landowner. Deborah?
Thank you again, Deborah. So me again. And yes, now I'm going to be focusing more on the private angle as a landowner and talking about a property that I purchased adjacent to the Sidling Hill Creek Preserve. Next slide. So here's a map of the area. In green is state land. So the majority of what you're seeing right now is owned by the state of Maryland. In pink is the Sidling Hill Creek Preserve, owned and managed by the Nature Conservancy. And the arrow is pointing, it's kind of hard to see the tract shape, but it's showing about 50 acres or 20 hectares of private land, and that is, thank you, that is what we purchased. This map doesn't show some conservation easements, but there's a fair bit of property also surrounding that's in easement, so therefore protected. And down through the middle of it is Sidling Hill Creek winding down. So next slide. Sidling Hill Creek Preserve and this property is a diverse array of different habitat types. It has shale barrens, which are very dry, bare habitats, which have a really interesting community of species adapted to this really harsh condition. It also has floodplain forest and riparian habitat. Along Sidling Hill Creek, the riparian habitat is really interesting because it's what we call a scour zone. In the winter, the creek freezes solid, and as the ice breaks up, it literally scours along these cobbles. So the result is vegetation that is adapted to these really dynamic conditions. And then we have wonderful mature upland forest with large trees and a really interesting array of wildlife. So next slide. Along those cobble riverbanks, we also have a globally rare plant called Harperellum or Tilium nodosum. This is actually a type of a carrot, and it can grow along these really dynamic rocky areas. And there are only 2 places in Maryland it occurs, and very few places in the world. And Sidling Hill Creek has pretty much the healthiest population that exists possibly in the world. And because of this globally rare plant, when we purchased our property at Sidling Hill, we were able to put a conservation easement on it, largely so that we could protect this globally rare plant. So next slide. So this conservation easement was purchased through a really wonderful program that the Department of Natural Resources of Maryland has called Program Open Space. And in this program, when private landowners purchase land, any land throughout the state, a portion of your taxes are set aside for Program Open Space. And Program Open Space funds are used specifically to protect areas either of important biological diversity or of important protection for farmland, but essentially some sort of form of protecting land in Maryland so that it's not developed. So next slide. So the first thing we had to do in order to consider putting an easement on the property is put together a forest management plan. And this is such an important first step. So many private landowners really don't have a good sense of what's on their land. What's the value of their timber? What sort of invasive species might they have? What are some management recommendations that a professional would make? So forcing the landowner to put together a forest management plan is such a terrific first step because they end up with a really comprehensive understanding of the land that they have and the value economically as well as biologically of their land. So we met with a forester. He walked around our property. He took a few days to assess. He talked with us about what our goals were for the property and why we purchased it and what we had in mind. And again, as I mentioned in my first presentation, the state of Maryland has some really excellent programs that help pay for, in this case, 75% of the cost of this management plan, so that really any private landowner can take advantage of these. So next slide. Once we had this plan, it outlined really nicely what we had on our land in terms of timber. It broke it down by our upland forest, our open prairie, our grassland or meadow habitat, as well as our shale barrens and where it all was in relation to the creek. So next slide. So by the numbers, this is how this particular conservation easement worked. To purchase the property, it cost us $232,000 to purchase these 50 acres or 20 hectares. The value of the conservation easement that the state was willing to give us was appraised at $55,000. The state of Maryland was willing to pay us $32,000, which we accepted. So then the $23,000 difference in value of this easement was recouped by us through partly we are receiving a $5,000 a year tax credit from our state taxes, and we'll continue to receive that until we've gone through the entire 23,000. And we also were able to federally claim on our federal taxes, claim the difference as a charitable giving tax deduction. And ultimately, the value of our property decreased, which is lowering our tax burden on the property. And what did the easements restrict us from doing? Well, we normally could divide this property into 5 lots and build a house on each one. And with the easement, we're only allowed to have our one house with an additional structure outside. We can't log the forest. We can cut down individual trees, say for firewood or their hazards, but we won't ever be able to log the entire forest. Part of this easement was called the FIDS easement, which is the Forest Interior Dwelling Bird easement. So it's protecting those really nice upland forests. We also can't run a business off of this property. We could farm it, we could have some animals, some goats, but we can't make a big extensive business out of it. But we could use the property for a tourism or an ecotourism business if we wanted to have hikers come through. And then the next slide. And so what are we doing? We've really been following that plan as carefully as we're able to. It's detailed very nicely where many of our invasive species were. So we've been working really hard to remove to our capacity those invasive species. It's hard work, but it's really satisfying. Next slide. The plan also suggested that we conduct a controlled burn through that meadow habitat, which is the 5 to 7 acres in front of the cabin. And we did that. And again, there's wonderful programs with the state of Maryland through the individual counties that bring it, if you have a conservation value, a conservation reason for burning, foresters will come in and they'll conduct that burn for you free of charge. So they did that. They came, they helped us burn our grassland, and the result was really spectacular resurgence of many of the native grasses, and it looks terrific. And we've had all sorts of really wonderful grassland birds come in as well. Next slide. And the results have been really neat. We set up a few cameras throughout the property, and we've found that we were protecting some really exciting wildlife. We have numerous pictures of bobcats. Next. We have coyote, one of which loves to pee regularly in front of one of the cameras, so I think that's just his way of saying hello. Next slide. And we've gotten bear, porcupine, fisher, which is a type of weasel, coming and visiting regularly. Next slide. And all sorts of other exciting creatures, deer, turkey. We've got these really cool piebald, bicolored deer, and a number of animals that we've captured that we have no idea what they are. So next slide. So what's really satisfying is we know that this is forever. Whether we decide to keep the property or we decide to sell it, it will always be protected. This easement runs with the land, even if we decide to sell it or transfer it. So it's a real satisfaction, not just that this program helped us to purchase and afford this property, but it also gives us the satisfaction of knowing that it'll never be developed and the ecological diversity will be protected forever. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deborah. All right, now we've got a little bit of time for questions and answers for our speakers. So we'll have the opportunity to hear the questions that you have typed into the Q&A box. A couple of them I have answered by typing in the answers, but a few of them I'm going to throw to our speakers so you can hear from them live. So we've heard about restoration projects all throughout the state of Maryland. And the first thing that I would like to throw to everybody is the question of what is one of the main motivations for landowners to engage in these restoration projects. They may be losing acreage for farming. Certainly there are efforts and expenses involved in doing land restoration. But let's hear first from Gabe Cahalan about why the Nature Conservancy engaged in this huge restoration project at Jackson Lane.
Well, thanks for that question. I think that the adjacent, because it was adjacent to a natural area that had many rare and endangered species, we wanted to provide a buffer to that area, as well as improve downstream water quality. So water from that site flows into the Choptank River, which ultimately flows to the Chesapeake Bay. So it was meeting both of those objectives, both habitat, buffer, and water quality.
Okay, thank you. And now we'll hear again from Deborah Landau. And first, Deborah L., I'll ask you why the Nature Conservancy, besides the fact that it is a TNC policy to seek sustainable forest certification on all timber harvests, what else was in FSC certification for the Nature Conservancy at Nassawango?
So visually, it really helps us. A lot of times people don't understand why a land conservation organization would come in and cut trees. So it helps show that we have a third party certifying that the manner in which we're conducting these harvests is sustainable and is done in an ecologically sensitive manner. But it also actually really opened our eyes to a lot of things that we hadn't thought about. It requires that you reach out to indigenous peoples that may once have used and lived on your land and explain to them what you're doing and why. So that really opened our eyes to other communities who share this land with us. It also made us think of things of where cemeteries are and what's beyond the cemeteries that we might not see. So it really, first from the optics, allows others to understand that we are conducting this in a responsible manner. But as a landowner, it also taught us so much about how to properly conduct these harvest operations in a socially and environmentally sensitive way.
Excellent. So thinking as a private landowner on your land at Sidling Hill Creek, you did a great job describing the financial return of the conservation easement on your land. What else was driving your behavior on that site?
So for us, coming as an employee of the Nature Conservancy, obviously I have a conservation background. So it was very satisfying to know that it was something that we wanted to do already, was preserve this land. But to be able to have the state come in and actually help us acquire it, help us put together this plan, and then know that it's protected forever is very, very satisfying. And I can't say enough about the program that the state has of helping private landowners pay for a forest plan. The plan is so eye-opening, and it just has so many aspects that a typical landowner is not going to think through, whether it's the acreage, the trees that you have, how to manage some of the invasives, some invasives you might not think of. It's a terrific way to have a large or small landowner end up with a very comprehensive management plan for your property.
Okay, great. And Mike, tell us a little bit more about what was driving Mr. Harkins in his allowing the Nature Conservancy to do this restoration work in the Pocomoke River floodplain.
Yeah, absolutely. Mr. Harkins, it's a unique story. The property that he owns, back in the 30s and 40s during the Depression, well, the 30s, a lot of that property was sold off, and Mr. Harkins, throughout the years, has had the opportunity to buy this back and bring this property back into one one piece of property again. And there's a lot of story behind all of that. But Mr. George is he's an outdoorsman, like I said earlier. And he supports these programs. He's been a huge supporter of the USDA in all their programs. And when we decided to come on board and help him with this property, he was extremely excited just because of our past relationship. And just the opportunity to create new habitat for him. Like I said, they're big hunters. They love to deer hunt and duck hunt. And, we're creating habitat for that, and they're really enjoying that. And also this program that the USDA offers and that we help facilitate, one of the major driving forces behind it is, also the financial incentive that a landowner gets at $1,800 an acre. It's sometimes hard to turn down. So, I got to be upfront about that. That's a big driving force for the program. But again, you also have landowners like Mr. Harkins that are in it just for the pure habitat.
Great, thank you. Deborah Landau, we've got a question. In Europe, more and more people seem to believe that harvesting forest automatically results in biodiversity loss. And we've learned at the Nature Conservancy that is not at all so. So we have participants who would like to hear how we're handling this communication challenge in the US.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it certainly is a challenge anywhere. And often harvesting does result in biodiversity loss. So that's one reason that having third-party certification, such as through the Forest Stewardship Council, is so helpful, because under their umbrella, you can demonstrate transparently that you follow these 10 very strict criteria during your management of the forest stand. And I can't say enough about pictures. You just saw my picture of our loblolly pine plantation, where there's nothing, literally nothing growing underneath. It's just a thick layer of pine needles. And in many of these areas, when we did our harvest, we had rare orchids come in, all these wonderful ephemeral wildflowers. We had so much diversity come back on their own, only by removing these pine plantations. So I think transparency with third-party certification, combined with pictures showing that when a harvest is done sustainably and responsibly, that the diversity can come back on its own.
Great, thank you. Gabe, we've got a question about the effects of the hydrological restoration at Jackson Lane on adjacent areas. Were there hydrological effects on adjacent farmland?
We did actually have some issues early on with the changing water levels, and we model the part of the planning process involves modeling the hydrology, and we use all the information we can, but models are often wrong. So, but after we did have some issues with adjacent landowners, we were able to make adjustments to some of the levels, and the techniques since that time have actually gotten better with not just ditch plugs, but various grading that can help with water levels and deal with the pulses of water that come in storms as well. So I think both the modeling has gotten better, and the number of techniques available for both stream and ditch restoration have gotten better since, this first one was about 15 years ago. So even just the LIDAR information we have now to create the hydrological models is better.
Okay, thank you. And we had a question for one of you specifically about how restored areas are maintained, but I'll throw that to each of you in turn. First, Deborah Landau, what do we do to maintain any of the restored areas that you've talked about?
That's a really good question. And that's again where having a management plan ahead of time can be really helpful. We use fire on all of these sites to maintain the restoration work. Fire is a process that's been removed from many of these natural areas, and it helps regenerate the native diversity. And the invasive plant removal, we continue to do that. And that's something I think that will never end.
Okay, great. Gabe, how do we maintain the restored area at Jackson Lane for the long term?
So we actually, after the restoration, we had beavers move back into the area within, I'd say, 5 years, I think. So we did have plans to maintain some of the ditch plugs over time, but the beaver have actually essentially started to manage the hydrology there for us. So now it's a matter of actually managing beaver instead of managing the restoration. So, and that can be a challenge. We have that challenge even without restoration, just managing natural areas with beavers and conflicts that arise with landowners. So it really becomes no different than managing the rest of our natural areas.
Thank you. Mike, what did Mr. Harkins sign up for in the long term? What kind of long-term restoration is necessary for his restoration lands?
For the long term, I mean, as far as the maintenance goes and all of that, I mean, we have to keep an eye on everything out there so that the restoration does stay how we planned it. So, I mean, as far as keeping a successful projects, keeping it so it stays successful, you know, we're looking for areas of erosion, if there's down trees and breaches, things of that sort that may stop what we're doing out there. So, you know, we do annual inspections on that just to make sure that the restoration's still, you know, going as planned, and that we're not destroying anything out there. You know, as far as like I mentioned, erosion, there's lots of issues with that sometimes. So we try to keep that all maintained, keep the property owner happy, and keep the restoration just going.
Mm-hmm. Great. All right. Thank you. I'm going to take just a moment to wrap it up before handing it back to Phil. We had one other question about who planted all these trees, who did the work for all these massive restoration projects. And from my cozy seat as Director of Land Management, I can tell you that a lot of large equipment and skilled contract labor was used for these restoration projects, funded by the various grant-making organizations. But TNC staff's presence on the ground in guiding these restorations was absolutely essential. In addition, we have the opportunity to engage volunteers in some of these restoration projects. Maybe volunteers can't get as many trees planted in a given day as a contractor who does this all the time, but engaging volunteers in our hands-on restoration work is a great way to enhance the Nature Conservancy's reputation in the community, to give people an opportunity, local people an opportunity to develop a long-term relationship with these lands. And honestly, having volunteers on site for some of our tree planting projects and the invasives control that is necessary after some of these restoration projects makes our work a whole lot more inspiring and fun. So we don't forget about our volunteers either. All right, well, thank you all, Deborah L., Gabe, Mike, for telling our participants about some of the work that we've been doing in Maryland. And we really hope to see many of you in person in 2021. If conditions permit. We very much look forward to the opportunity to show you some of these places on the ground, getting your feet wet, and we really hope this can happen. So thank you for joining us virtually today. And now Phil will tell you a little bit about what you'll hear about in the next seminar.
Well, let me first add my thanks to Deborah, Mike, and Gabe for an excellent presentation and providing a wide range of information to our listeners. And I really want to express our appreciation for the great work you're doing and the great presentation you made. And I also want to encourage you to join us on Wednesday, September 23rd at the same time and same station, if you will, when you'll hear more about the Nature Conservancy and our partners' work in the state of Virginia, also in the mid-Atlantic area of the United States. We have some great panelists there, and we'll tell you more about some of the interesting projects that we're doing using new conservation tools to accomplish our conservation projects. So I encourage you all to tune in on Wednesday, the 23rd at 10 a.m. Eastern, 4 o'clock Europe time. And I look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you very much and have a good day.